and healthy working from home in this kind of quarantined environment that we're all in? That's the question that I wanted Pete Jensen to be able to answer for you. He's a coach, facilitator. He's trained over 20,000 people around the world, and his book, Lessons in Happiness from the Third World, is a must read. And Pete's going to talk to you how to think about maintaining health and mental well-being once the novelty of this work from home thing wears off and some of the social isolation really starts to kick in. He's going to talk about how to create a work from home dynamic that actually sets people up for success, how to boost personal happiness and energy, some of the big mental health pitfalls that come from working in isolation, and how you can create safety nets, not just to support yourself and your family, but your team as well. So I think you're going to get a lot out of Pete, but before I hand you over to him, let me just give you a little bit of context. So you're about to sit in on a session from one of our crisis reinvention team, but let me give you some quick context. When COVID started to seriously impact businesses, we mobilized experts from within the Dent community to be able to help business leaders like yourself navigate the difficult decisions across a variety of topics, including how to access finance and grants, to cash management, to human resource law, to marketing and sales strategies, to cool tools and tech that you can use from home, through to high stakes leadership, health, wellness, stress management, not just for yourself, but for your team, and look, a whole lot more. For the full schedule, with more being added every week, visit dent.global/reinvent, and we hope you find it a useful resource. All right, let's do this.
Hi, and welcome to the session of quarantine, avoiding the downward well-being spiral. I guess the question really is more about what do I need to do to keep my people focused, thriving and productive during this period of social isolation, especially once the novelty is worn off. I've been having a lot of conversations lately with business owners and business leaders. And whilst they're really super excited that people have embraced the change and, they've gone to office works, bought all the equipment and are working happily at home at the moment, most of them express the same concern, which really is, so what happens when the novelty wears off? Because this could be a month, 3 months, 6 months, who knows? In fact, in the last week, which is the last week of March, Beyond Blue have seen an increase of 30% already of people making calls around their mental health. My name is Pete Jensen, and I'm delighted to be working with you and having this conversation for the next 50 minutes or so. And yes, I'm also working from home. We've had a break in the rain, and the doves are making some beautiful sounds outside. There is something rather quaint about working from home, and with it also a sense of vulnerability. And my Danish relatives would probably call that home hygge. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, just a little bit more about myself. So I own a company called Jensen, and I'm a consultant, speaker, author, and facilitator. I specialize in helping organizations create work and work environments where their people can truly thrive in terms of their well-being, be that physical, mental, and social well-being. The biggest challenge that leaders are facing is, what is it? Where do I start? Am I covering everything? Am I doing enough? How do I know if things are successful? And I spent the last few years traveling in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and Denmark, delivering workshops and masterclasses around perhaps shifting our paradigm in terms of how we view well-being and how we view people. I tend to have a rather conversational style, so if I can invite you to perhaps not think of this as an online training program, but rather one big conversation. So let's kick off. At a high level, there are 3 things I'd like to share with you today. And the first one is, what does a successful strategy for well-being in isolation look like? The second thing is, how can my team create sustained happiness for the long haul and sustained energy? And what are the necessary safety nets to navigate change and uncertainty? And we certainly are in a period of change and uncertainty right now, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So let's kick off. I'd like to touch the first topic, which is your role as a leader in creating a successful strategy for well-being in isolation. And whilst these principles have been around long before COVID-19, I'd like to take a particular focus as to how we address the challenges we have right now with people working from home, especially as the novelty starts to wear off a little, and you may be experiencing a bit of cabin fever already. Who knows? I do a lot of conferences, and often this is the first slide that I bring up to have a big discussion around what is well-being, first of all, and then what's causing the well-being headache for team members. And I throw a question out to the audience, and I might as well throw it out to you as well. When somebody has a headache, what do we tend to give them? And more often than not, the answers come back: Nurofen, Panadol, any form of headache medication. And I go, yep, correct. But what if that's not what people actually need? What if they're just thirsty and all they need is a glass of water? And I think in some ways, the way we've been addressing well-being up until now has been pretty much a one-size-fits-all, and here it is, and that should fix you. And it's really about understanding, what are people's needs? What is that glass of water that people need? And that'll change during the day, during the week, and during the months ahead. Where's the problem from a leadership perspective? There's a wonderful quote by Alex Den Heyer, and he says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And I think part of that is the challenge that the way that we design work and the way that we design workplaces, and in particular now during COVID-19 where the workplace is at home, it's not about fixing the person. Too many times traditional leadership is about if we can fix the person, if we can fix their behaviors, if we can get them right, then we'll reduce the unwanted events and costs to the business. To me, I kind of take this view that Alex has, which is more about creating the environment in which people can thrive. I don't think that people need fixing. They just need to be in the right environment. I know for myself, when I've worked in the wrong environment, the impact that that's had on me, and that is actually all about the environment. Not so much there was something wrong with me as a person. When we take this approach, I guess the next question is going to be, well, so what does a gold medal look like? How do I create the garden that fits my people? And of course, different people will have different needs. And a good place to start would be to look at the definition of well-being. And I always return to source. So the World Health Organization describes well-being as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I was running a workshop once where one of the participants had been off work for 6 months, quite severely ill, and she said, I couldn't wait to get back to work because when I'm at work, I feel great and I'm happy and I thrive and I flourish. So the focus for leaders is a couple of things in this definition. A, it's about complete. It's about people being complete at work. It's physical, it's mental, but there's also a huge social component to well-being as well. The second part of this is that it's looking for the presence of wellness as opposed to an absence of disease or an absence of sick leave or an absence of claims. So this really forms a framework, I guess, that we can look at in terms of, so how does this play out in terms of me as a leader? What should I be incorporating in my well-being strategy? I look at this as 3 key areas or 3 key components, but you can break them down into their subparts. So from a physical well-being perspective, the first is occupational health. It's ergonomics, it's how we design workplaces, et cetera, et cetera. The second part is body management. And this is really how we manage our physical self. So whether that's to do with nutrition, whether that's to do with exercise, whether that's to do with fatigue and how we manage fatigue. And the third part of physical well-being is the whole mind-body thing, calming the mind. Organizations look at teaching things like mindfulness or resilience, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think many organizations do this quite well. And I'm just talking at it from a structure level at the moment. We'll relate it to social isolation in a moment. Let's take a look at the next core component of well-being, and that's mental well-being. And to me, this is where we start to see a bit of a change. There's a big difference between mental health and mental well-being. And I think a lot of organizations are doing a lot of good stuff with great intent around mental health, but there's more to it. So the way I look at it is that if you imagine a mountain that has a cliff. Mental health to me is the people who are on the cliff. They may be going through depression, stress, anxiety, some more chronic or clinical disorders. They're quite at risk. And we're really good at putting things in place when people are on the edge of the cliff. So we have employee assistance programs. We have Beyond Blue. We have Men's Sheds. We have Mates in Construction. We have a whole lot of services for people on the edge or who have maybe fallen over the edge. But what about the people that are in the middle of the mountain? They're not at the edge. They might be drifting down there, but they're struggling with doing life, which is the second component. And I guess we all are in many different ways, whether it's mortgage stress, financial issues, relationship issues, challenging teenagers or children, substance dependency. How equipped are people to deal on a day-to-day basis just with the stresses of modern life? The third area of mental well-being is around personal growth. And to me, that's a really, really important part. Dan Pink wrote a book called Drive, and he talks about what motivates people in terms of intrinsic motivation. Not so much money, but intrinsic motivation. And he highlights three things: purpose, autonomy, and mastery, or developing skills or personal growth. Social well-being is the one that's often forgotten and so important at the same time. Graham Cowan, who founded Are You OK Day, did some research and last year published that in Australia, 2019, 25% of workers have zero social connection with each other, not a coffee, no social interaction. And that's 1 in 4. Now, when you look at social well-being, connection is the first one. You know, we're all designed to connect and belong and have a place where we belong and a place where we feel valued. The second element of social well-being is contribution. So contributing to something outside of ourselves, whether that be a cause or a charity or something in nature, but having the sense of contribution. The third element of social well-being is celebration. A big difference between celebration and recognition. Celebration has social context and social value. I was with a senior director of a client about 3 months ago, and he was sharing that, you know, Pete, I get that. I get the difference between celebration and recognition. In the past, in our organization, when somebody had a birthday, we would celebrate that individual. You know, we'd buy a cake, we'd stop for 10 minutes, the whole team would get together. But we've now been told there's no budget for that. So we recognize them in the monthly, update or monthly newsletter. And where's the social value in that? So taking a look at these 9 key components of well-being, I would often say to a group, you know, which are the 3 that you're doing well? Which are the 3 that are most challenging? Why don't you run a survey with your team? Find out what their glass of water, so to speak, is, what their needs are in that space. And I might imagine that as we think about working in isolation, this becomes even more important. You know, what can we help our people with in terms of mind-body? What are the conversations we can have around body management? You know, you're working at home all the time. How much movement are you doing? How much exercise are you getting? In terms of the skills for doing life, in terms of personal growth, for example, you know, what courses could you be learning? What new skills? How are you going to reinvent yourself? And then the social well-being as well. So this really is a framework for well-being outside of the current pandemic that we're in, but certainly now that we're in it and we're looking to what are the areas we need to pay attention to once the novelty wears off. These would be some useful conversations to be having with our people and hearing, you know, successful strategies and how people are getting on. That's all good. But how do you apply this? So I'd like to talk through 3 principles of holistic well-being. And naturally, in a full-day workshop or the online programs that I run, we drill a whole lot deeper. We look at tools, we look at strategies, we look at tactics. I share a lot of case studies of where organizations have actually brought this to life. I will share one with you a little later. But for me, there are 3 key principles to holistic well-being. The first one, as per the definition of well-being from the World Health Organization, I believe people are already complete. They don't need fixing, so to speak, with the headache analogy. In fact, Patty McCord, who is the past CEO of Netflix, puts it really well. He says, our job as an organization is not to empower people, but it's more to remind them that they walk in the door with the power already in them and create the conditions for them to exercise it and thrive and flourish. So for me, thinking about social isolation at the moment, our people have great ideas. Sometimes we just need to cut them a little bit of slack, give them a little bit of freedom, or as Amy Edmondson says in her wonderful TED talk on psychological safety, just take our foot off the brakes a little bit, allow them to manage things and allow them to come up with ideas and solutions and innovations. Trust them. The second principle, and for me, this has been the big paradigm shift around well-being, is traditional leadership and management has been focused on the absence of illness part. If we can minimize claims, if we can minimize disruption and just get back to work, everything will be fine. Whereas true well-being is actually about identifying and seeing where wellness is. It's not just the absence of illness, it's actually the presence of wellness. And as leaders, we need to get a lot more curious about that. In your teams, you'll have people that are managing it really well. Go and have a conversation. David Ledbetter, if you haven't come across him, he's the founder of this called Appreciative Inquiry. But go and have a conversation with your team members during this pandemic and go, why is it that you always seem perky, that you're energized, that you're productive? What are the things that you're doing? Let's learn from that, rather than focusing on just trying to minimize the negatives. The third principle is that purpose fuels performance. And I'm sure as a business owner or a business leader, this is nothing new. You'd probably be a big fan of Simon Sinek and his TED talk on finding the why. But during this time of social isolation, how can you help your people find some form of purpose? For however long they're going to be at home, how are they going to emerge on the other side? What is their role and what is their purpose? Think about your communication. Do you take the time to explain the reason why in everything that you're doing? I like to break it up where I go, this is what I need to do, so that. So here's the task, so that, which really talks about the impact, and people can draw on that in terms of the purpose of why we're doing things. As I said earlier, spent a lot of time drilling down into, so how do you do this and what are some tools? But I just wanted to identify perhaps a shift in our thinking as leaders and also where our focus goes in terms of managing well-being. The case study I made reference to a little earlier, Barry Wehmiller is an organization. They employ 14,000 people. If you haven't read this book yet, now that you've got some time on your hands and there's no sport on the on the telly and we can't go out socially, Everybody Matters, the extraordinary power of caring for your people like family. The reason why I've chosen this case study is because Barry Wehmiller went through a very similar situation to what we're going through at the moment. So during the time of the GFC, this organization, which is blue collar manufacturing, employs 14,500 people, experienced a loss of 35% of their income overnight. And you can just imagine the climate was already GFC time. And Bob Chapman, who's the CEO, has built a culture where everyone matters. If you think about the 9 elements of well-being that we had a look at earlier, very, very strong in those areas. So the executive said, well, we have to can people. We've got to, fire people, get rid of people. And Bob's answer was no. What will be the impact on those that remain? What does this say about our culture? I have a different idea. And I won't spoil the surprise for you if you're going to read the book, but he put another strategy in place. And in the end, they didn't fire anybody. They didn't find the 10 million that the banks were looking for either. They found $20 million in savings. The next year, they had the highest turnover in their 100 years of history. Which business owner doesn't want to emerge from coronavirus with those kind of results? So when I think about what Bob did, very, very strong on community. In their organization, there are no employees. There's a husband who has a wife and children. There's a wife who might have a husband and children who live in a community. Very strong on celebration, some really cool tactics about how to give social value in terms of celebrating. Very, very strong on the mental well-being part, which is around personal growth and development. and it's almost an expectation in that organization. So there are a lot of very successful organizations that have embraced those 9 elements in their culture, in their well-being strategy. And I'd encourage you to think about those. Have conversations with your people. Ask them what would work for them in terms of personal growth, for example, or in terms of celebration, or in terms of connection. The second topic I'd like to touch on today really is, how do you sustain happiness? And how do you sustain energy? And this is really more for individuals and for team members. And again, it's a great conversation that you could have with them. Now, I think this is going to get a little bit personal as I share some of my stories. And for me, the self-isolating is really nothing new. I live alone. I work alone. I'm not married. I don't have children. I don't have immediate family. So I guess I've been used to this condition for a while. And there are 2 things that I do deliberately to help sustain and give me the best shot at my happiness, energy, innovation, productivity, etc. I have daily rituals that I practice, and I have deliberate safety nets that I put in place for when things do go a little bit pear-shaped. So the question is, how can my team members create sustained happiness and energy? And obviously with that comes performance, innovation, creativity, and the rest of it. And I wish I could say that I'd always been like this, but alas, there was a time, we're going back about 10 years, when I went through the toughest journey that I've been through in my life. I went through 18 months of depression and anxiety. And they're 2 very, very different beasts. Depression, on the one hand, is where you just lose the appetite to care at all. Whereas anxiety, I guess, is where you care too much, and it freezes your thinking. Now, at the time, I was on medication. I was seeing a counselor, and for me personally, neither of those were working. I went through the 18 months. I put on a lot of weight. I was working from home, quote unquote, which is really code for self-medicating. I threw my money into business ventures that I wasn't thinking clearly and ended up broke. And I got to the point where I actually said, that's it, I'm done. And had a very long conversation with my sister, and clearly I'm not, because here I am today. What was it that helped me turn around without the medication, without the counseling? And at my darkest moment, once I'd had that conversation, I stopped and thought. And the question I was asking myself is this: I'm on medication. I look around in the Western world and, depression, stress, anxiety, this is 10 years ago. There's evidence of it everywhere. Yet where I grew up in Africa, my parents were missionaries. So I grew up with the poorest of the poor in the indigenous communities. The thought that hit me like a flash was, why is it that when you travel to, and I call them third world countries when I wrote the book, but when you travel to less fortunate countries, people who've got so little seem to find it so much easier to be joyful. And based on my own and also doing a lot of social research, I wrote a book called Lessons in Happiness from the Third World. What have we forgotten in the West, or what have we become so busy that it's become less important or had less priority in our lives? And I guess in some kind of big way, this pandemic at the moment is forcing us to rethink many of those things. Just for a bit of comic relief, I guess in terms of my story, I've mentioned the big question already, but this was me at that time. Ballooned out to 128 kilos, and 2 years later, finishing the Melbourne Half Marathon. So what was this all about? Well, my challenge was around 3 things, I guess, and it was sustaining happiness moving forward. So firstly, happiness is a daily ritual. I don't think that happiness happens by chance or by luck. And great leaders and great sportsmen often talk about the power of ritual. In the book, The Power of Full Engagement by Jim Loehr and Tony Schwartz, where they talk about why athletes can perform, they all talk about ritual. So for me, well-being, energy, happiness, it's all about a daily ritual. It's a work ethic. The second thing for me was that there are 3 core ingredients to happiness, and I'll talk about those in a moment. If you look at, I guess, the third world, community, purpose and spirituality, and then gratitude. The third thing is that recovery is not a straight line. We all have our ups and downs, and the world is not perfect. However, what's really important is putting safety nets in place. And I'm going to talk about safety nets today for social isolation. While times are good, while times are good, that's when we've got to put the safety nets in place so that when we do start to spiral, we don't bottom out completely. I want to talk about three of those, the three key elements. And obviously in the book and during a workshop, there's a lot more to it, but I've just pulled out probably three from each list as they relate to working in social isolation at the moment. The first one is belonging, and it's a key human need. So belonging and connection for myself, but also for the rest of my team. There'll be a lot of people who are challenged and go, well, I might not have people. I don't have friends. I don't have places to belong. And my answer often to them is, well, then go and find a place. In a normal world, there are people looking for volunteers. There are people looking for mentors. If you don't have a friend, try being a friend. Thinking about the pandemic that we're going through at the moment, I have gone and done shopping for my neighbors. I have neighbors that pop in and check in on me and do things. So where are some places that you can create connection, and what are some strategies that people could use as we go through the coronavirus and the self-isolation? But it's really important to maybe have a chat to your team members as to their specific needs. Some will be married with families, others may be single. What are they doing about creating a sense of belonging? The second thing, and this is going to be huge, is identity. I'm a resource to a number of CEO groups and organizations, and often I'll run a retreat with their partners as well. And we get to this piece, and I just stop and say, if I took away your job title, who are you? And you see the eyes drop. You see, because in the modern world, in so many ways, our work defines us. I'm the vice president of sales. I'm this, I'm that. And often when people retire, they struggle because all they know is their work. If you go to the third world, people are very clear on their identity, where they belong in the community, what their role is, what their responsibilities are. And this may be a time to reflect on that. What is actually my identity? Am I a coach at the Nippers? What else do I do outside of work? The third thing that I notice in the third world is it abounds with customs, traditions, and rituals, and they might relate to spirituality or religion or faith. They might relate to the seasons, for example, but there's a lot of traditions and rituals. I remember one in the good old days that we used to have called Sunday lunch. I don't know if anyone remembers that. No social media, no phones, just Sunday lunch where everyone sat and spoke. So what are some traditions and rituals that you can create around this self-isolating period? I had virtual drinks with my group of mates last Friday, and we did it using Zoom, and we've agreed that every Friday afternoon at 5:00, we're going to get together. It's going to become a tradition or a ritual. So this may be a great conversation to have with your team members. The second element is purpose. And again, purpose for me is really powerful because purpose fuels performance. Purpose drives the reason why I get out of bed every day. And the challenge with purpose so often is that people think it's got to be something grandiose, find a cure for cancer, join Greenpeace or a warrior, go and save the planet. Purpose is actually a very simple thing, but it's really clear, really important to clearly define it for yourself. My purpose is threefold: to be a good brother and an uncle. The second part is to be a loyal friend. And the third thing is to make a difference to people every day. That's it. And I measure my life where I put my time, where I put my energy around my purpose. I connect with it on a daily basis. If a friend or my family need me, I'll take a day off work and just spend time with them, because when I'm doing that, I'm actually living my purpose. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. I would have resented having to invest that time. But today it's part of what I do. So knowing your purpose is really clear. And again, this may be a useful time in self-isolation to think that one through, do some additional reading, share it with others. The second thing is I actually visualize my success around my purpose. So there's a powerful thing in the brain that the brain cannot differentiate between imagination and reality. It sees them as the same thing. The great Einstein actually said that. He said, what you see on the movie screen of your mind is a preview of life's coming attractions. Sportsmen are all over this. As you visualize it, your whole being moves towards it as if it's a reality. Disney, if you can dream it, you can do it. So I actually think about that. And a question you might be asking your teams right now is, when this coronavirus pandemic is over, who will you be? What will you have learned? And how are people going to see? What is going to be your sense of purpose going forward? And then tap into that on a daily basis. The third part of purpose for me is connecting with something bigger than myself. And for some people, it could be spirituality. For others, it might just be something as simple as mindfulness and, spending time. I can sit and look at a flower like with awe, like a kid for 20 minutes, just, connecting with something outside myself. Nature is a great one. And I'm sure there are a lot of dogs that are being walked a lot at the moment. But there's an opportunity, again, to connect with something larger than oneself. The third element is gratitude. And I find that really interesting. We've become, I guess, quite self-obsessed or selfish or focused on so many things in the modern world. You hear things in the West. People say things like, I'll be happy when I get the car, the house, the job, the partner, the yacht. Whereas in the third world, it's like, how can I just be happy with what I have? Maybe today is all I've got. So in terms of gratitude, building this as a ritual or discipline, I guess the first thing is I consciously show gratitude to others. So what is something that you could consciously do during this time of socialization? It may be physical, it may be doing something for someone. It could be picking up the phone and just checking in. But what are some things that you could do to consciously show gratitude to others? And we know science will back this up, that when we do that, it actually benefits ourselves at a physical, emotional, mental, so many different levels. I consciously show gratitude to myself. There's a tough one. Probably the hardest one of the 3 bullet points. We are so good at beating ourselves up for not being perfect, for not completing everything on the to-do list. How are you consciously going to show gratitude to yourself and appreciate yourself? What are some practical things you can do? Sometimes it's just a mental thing and just not beating yourself up. I need to do that at times for bad habits or not completing things. But what are the things that you consciously do? And thirdly, around gratitude is if you have a family or a group of friends, what are some rituals that you can create around that? Now, in a non-coronavirus world, there are many things you can do. I know families that go and do beach cleanups or do things outdoors. Here's a simple one. Having a daily ritual around what was your high, what was your low, and what are you grateful for? And having a conversation and maybe drilling a bit deeper as to why is that important to you, etc. So again, thinking around maybe teams. What are some team gratitude rituals? I still had to work that organization that I was involved in when I went through my tough period. And the next 6 months were difficult. Traveling in every day, I dragged myself out of the quicksand. But I had time on the train and I created a gratitude journal and I asked myself 4 questions every single day. And I do this right up till now because I believe that you can actually set yourself up with the best shot for happiness. And the 4 questions are, what's going to be my adventure today? Big or small? It may just be a coffee with a mate, or in social isolation, it might be going out and working in my garden, but this is back to how the mind works. When you have something to look forward to, you start living it as if it's already happened. So question 1 to think about is, what's going to be my adventure today? Question 2 is, who can I show a kindness today? And what will it be? So think of somebody and think of a kindness and think of something that you can do for them. Thirdly, no surprises here. What's a kindness I'm going to show to myself? And finally, what am I grateful for? So I just kind of offer that to you as a framework. And this is not a silver bullet, but I certainly know when I've had some days that have gone pear-shaped and I reflect and I go, yeah, you didn't do the 4 questions, did you? There are other days where I do the 4 questions and it goes pear-shaped anyway. That's fine. At least I've given myself the best shot. So just some tips to focus on and some tips that you can maybe share with your team members as well. I'm going to move into the last section, and I promised to talk about some safety nets. And generally, there'd be a lot of frequently asked questions, and I'm going to try and answer those in the form of these safety nets. So first of all, what does reinvention mean? We talk reinvention, but what does it really mean in the way that we communicate and what we communicate? Words have energy, and as leaders, we've got a huge responsibility in what and also how we communicate them. There's a great book by Susan Scott, and one of her quotes is, long after people have forgotten what we've said, they'll still remember how you made them feel. So we'll take a look at that, especially in terms of reinvention. How do I make it safe for people to speak up? Right now more than ever, we need to be aware of the early warning signs long before they happen, especially as the novelty starts to wear off. So what stops people from speaking up, and how can we empower them, create that trust, maybe give them a tool to help them overcome that fear of speaking up? How can I negate the addictive behaviors associated with isolation, loneliness, or emptiness? And I'll talk about that because, you may be finding even right now that there's a tendency to spend a lot more time on social media or the phone or just procrastinate. And what's actually really sitting behind that? And what if that was to get worse? And how's that serving us? How can I shift mine and my team members' thinking to a positive state? And again, this is what we focus on generally, is what we do and who we are. And the final question is, how can we minimize the effects of stress, depression, and anxiety as this pandemic drags on? So I'd like to do that in the form of a couple of safety nets. And as I was saying earlier, when times are going well, this is when it's really important to set these things up before the proverbial hits the fan. And so I've just picked 6 today, proven safety nets to navigate the change and uncertainty of social isolation. And we're going to be going through a lot of change. I'm sure many of you already have, but also uncertainty. So the first one I'd like to talk to is fill the void and replace your addiction or distraction with a new reward system. I think for many people, there's a huge void. When we think about the things that we traditionally do, we get together with friends, hang out, we go to movies. I like to watch a lot of sport. I like to play a lot of sport. And now we're sitting in a situation where we need to confront that void and actually be comfortable with those feelings. I wrote a blog a few months ago where I posed the question, is there a correlation between loneliness and isolation and addiction? And I believe that there's a very strong correlation, and evidence and science will bear that out as well. If we think about the world that we're in, pre-coronavirus, already the UK had appointed a minister for loneliness. It's actually a portfolio in government. In Australia, Dr. Michelle Kim heads up the Australian Coalition to End Loneliness. So it's real in our own world. In America, Harvard Business Review study talks about the impact of social isolation on physical health being equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and how that shortens your life. So on the one hand, pre this, we had the highest levels of loneliness in the world, and at the same time, we had the highest levels of addiction. And addiction is not just, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, etc. Addiction can be many things. You could have a food addiction. You could have being addicted to being cynical. There are many different addictions that people have. So because there is this connection, it's about understanding where that comes from. And I'm going to look down because I want to make sure I get her name right. Rachel Wurzman. So her surname is Wurzman. Do yourself a favor and have a look at that TED Talk, because she talks about the neuroplasticity of the brain and the biology that sits behind this. And her talk is about how isolation fuels opioid addiction in the States. And what she says pretty much is what we're talking about. People are not comfortable with emptiness, and we immediately look for a reward system, or we look for a distraction. And the reason for that is because our oxytocin levels are so low. So we're needing a hit of oxytocin. If we don't get that hit, we become restless, irritable, discontent. And so it's almost an automated pattern of response. I know for myself that I needed to learn to be comfortable with the void and comfortable with loneliness. So as I mentioned in my personal and professional life, I spent a lot of time alone. And I found at one stage, and I did warn you, this is going to get a little personal, but I found that I didn't have a healthy relationship with alcohol. I wasn't an alcoholic, but I didn't have a healthy relationship with alcohol. And how it worked was like this. I'd come home at 10 o'clock or midnight, having worked interstate, driving through the suburbs, everyone's looking all loved up and happy, and there's that dark, empty house. And you get home and you go, oh man, I don't have anyone around. Gee, you've worked really hard today. You've earned a drink. And of course, I'd have a few, which then became, I've been for a long cycle out of my own. Geez, I've earned a drink. And so I was monitoring this, and I then took a year off alcohol. And it was a really interesting period of my life because I needed to learn to be comfortable with the void. So if I'm alone tonight and there's nobody around, is having a drink going to change that? Probably not. What can I do tomorrow to change that? So again, just a conversation possibly to have with people about being comfortable with, I think we call it cabin fever today, but thinking about what are our addictions? Where do we tend to get our oxytocin hit straight away? And could we substitute that with something else? Learning a new skill, cooking, playing an instrument. What could be your reward system? The second safety net for me is really about setting boundaries and also measuring your activity. In social isolation, everything's merging into one. And I like to look at setting boundaries around work time, home time, and me time. And I think more than ever, you need to have conversations with your team members about how they chunk their work down in terms of that, and then measure it. Look at transitions, for example. So I know that when I finish working at 5, my transition is exercise. It used to be the gym, but now I'll go out for a walk for an hour and a half. And when I come back from that work, I'm into home time. So maybe thinking about how you're going to transition from one to the other, measuring it. Again, give people some autonomy. But if you went into my study, there are charts and graphs all over the place because I set targets of how much of those 3 chunks of time I'm going to do a week. But then I bring in a whole lot of flexibility, and I might take a day off and do nothing, but then I'll catch up. But at the end of the day, I measure and I check. Create daily rituals with an accountability partner. There's a good one. I have a few. I have a neighbor who has a dog, and we walk the dog every morning. That's a ritual that we have. Now, there are many mornings where I haven't slept well or I just don't feel like getting up. But because I have an accountability partner, I get up and I do it. Creating daily rituals. For example, my mom is 90 years old. She lives on her own in Denmark. And there's a ritual where the community has a roster and people ring her every day at 8 o'clock in the morning just to say good day. And I think the benefits are, that they're checking in on her. But the flip side is she needs to be up and ready to take that call as well. So how could you create some of those rituals within your team? I mean, it pretty much is like having that first cup of coffee in the morning. And how could you do that at multiple times during the day? Because I think something to be aware of is that people's mood is going to move and fluctuate all day. So what are some rituals and how can you create accountability around that in a virtual environment with your teams? The next safety net is, again, figuring out where you are in the change cycle and looking forward towards the next stage in the change cycle. We're going through change. People are going to deal with it in many different ways. Some will move quickly through the change cycle. Others might take a very, very long time. And the stages are, stage 1 is denial. Stage 2 is resistance. Then there's acceptance. And finally, there's commitment. I had to leave my beachside home for 3 months last year to go and stay with and help out a friend. And again, this is my purpose talking. So it was difficult to lock up my little pad 100 meters from the beach with golf clubs and canoes and my mates and just the beautiful environment and move an hour away into another suburb, which maybe wasn't quite in the same demographic. But I did it because it's my purpose. And when I got there, I went straight into denial. This is not going to be that long. I'll be out of here in a hurry, etc. Well, that didn't change. So looking towards the next stage was resistance. And I was starting to complain and get grumpy and find all the faults in the space that I was in. But looking forward to the next stage is acceptance. And to me, here's the kicker. I started looking for some good things about the change. And here's what I found. I found a cycling track, which is absolutely fantastic off the road. Then I found some walking tracks. Then I discovered a mountain that's got amazing off-road walking tracks. Lo and behold, there was a sports bar there with access to cable TV, so I could watch my beloved rugby union and other sports happening around the world. And as I started looking, I found a Pilates studio, a lot cheaper than the Bayside suburb that I live in. Even food and supplements that I take seem to be cheaper in this other area. And the more I looked, the more I started finding positive things. And before you know it, I was into commitment stage. So this may be a very useful conversation to have with your team members because there's an impact on our mental health, depending on the stage that we're in. And that can be negative, or we can turn that into something positive as well. So I would check in with them, but I'd also have that conversation about it's okay to be where you are, but where are you looking to go? What's the next stage you're looking to get to? Safety number 5 is don't wait for feedback until it's too late. Build your courage to seek it and give it. Here, as a business owner or a leader, you need to step up and take that role. This is about being vulnerable. This is about being willing to share that you don't have all the answers. You need everybody else's voice. You need other people's ideas. You might miss something. They might pick something up. This is really inviting voice. It's inviting conversation. Now, for a lot of people, it's a challenge. And as I said earlier, wouldn't you want to know the early warning signs before they happen? So you need to step up as a leader and be willing to be vulnerable and ask for feedback, and feedback on yourself too. But the other side is the giving of feedback. A lot of people find it difficult to start the conversation. A tip that I could offer you is a book by Susan Scott called Fierce Conversations. The hardest part about having conversations or giving feedback is getting it started. So we hold on to stuff and that hurts ourselves. She teaches a 60-second, 5-step process to get the whole thing out there in a way that I take ownership of it, but the other person doesn't get defensive. So again, Fierce Conversations, Susan Scott. Finally, watch your language. It creates energy. I wrote a little piece on this not too long ago. And every word that we share has energy attached to it. And I will look down on my list because there's a few I'd like to share with you. The word social distancing. Well, I actually think that this is a time where we need to be more socially connected than ever before. And I prefer to use the word physical distancing because we still need to connect. Self-isolating. How does that land with you? And to me, this is really not about the isolating of my entire self. It's more about physical isolating because, again, we need to have that connection. There's a lot of talk about a recession and there will be huge economic impacts of where we go going forward. But if you think about that for a moment, how does that sit with you versus the word reinvention? I think we have the greatest opportunity to reinvent ourselves. I don't think the world that awaits us around the corner will ever be like the one that we've just been in. So this is a time for reinvention. My beloved mum, who's 90, we spoke about her living through the world wars. And she said, after World War II, there were so many new ideas, new innovations, doing things in a different way. That's exactly what's sitting. So why don't we talk about a reinvention? Another frame is a lot of people are hankering already with cabin fever for when things return to normal. It ain't going to happen. How about we substitute that to I'm looking forward to our new way of life going forward? And finally, one that I couldn't help stealing from Amy Edmondson is people often talk about the problem. She likes to reframe that as it's not a problem. It's just a puzzle that you need to solve. So hopefully that helps you just thinking about how your language lands with people in your teams. I've really enjoyed sharing a long conversation with you. I guess the question really from my side is, well, what's next? And this is a time where we want to contribute to our communities. So there are a few things I'd like to share with you, and I'm just going to call them free gifts. So one is a 21 Steps to Happiness Challenge, which is a series of quests that I developed some time ago, and you could pick one a week. I also have a little ebook with 200 happiness tips, and they were framed around the key elements of happiness, so community, purpose, gratitude, and life balance. And again, not all of them will apply given that we're in a physical isolation at the moment, but there'd be heaps of things you can have a look at. For me, 2 things: listening to music, just turning off the TV, grabbing out some old photo albums. What could that do for you as you reflect on good times? The third free gift is a slide deck from today. So the PowerPoint slides and the information and the tips and the structure. There may be some of you who want to do a little bit more. So if you mention that you've been on this webinar, I'd really be happy to offer you a 25% discount on a few things that I have. One is a 3-month online program for leaders. So shifting the paradigm around well-being, and also one for team members, which again, being on the middle of the mountain, what are some of the skills that I need for doing life? I also have a well-being coaching program using a formal assessment. It's called the GLWS tool, 136 questions, evidence-based, tested, for leaders who are looking for coaches. And naturally, I have my book as well, which contains a whole lot of tips as well. So it's been great. Nice getting to know you. Love to stay in contact. So look me up on LinkedIn. I have two websites, larsonjensen.com and facilitatinghappiness.com. I have an email if you'd like to contact me directly about anything. And we're all working from home anyway. So there's my mobile phone number if you'd like to reach out and stay in contact, or just give me some feedback. We're always looking for feedback as facilitators and presenters. So thank you so much for this time. And I hope you're looking forward to when you re-emerge, who you're going to be, what's it going to be like when we get back out there. Thank you so much.
For more expert talks, just visit dent.global/reinvent, because we believe that the decisions that you make now matter more than ever. We started Dent 10 years ago in the middle of the GFC in London, and we shared the key person of influence methodology as a tool to be able to help businesses thrive despite the chaos. Today, it's a best-selling book, and over 3,000 businesses use the methodology like an operating system for driving performance. And we've learned that regardless of economic conditions, that your primary focus as a founder should be showing up as the go-to brand, the key person of influence in your industry. More important than systems or social media, more important than Facebook videos or launching a website, the goal of showing up as the key person of influence in your industry should be the organizing force. It should be the primary objective that helps align all your other decision making. Because as your influence and reach expands, it becomes easier and cheaper to attract clients, team, media, even investors. When times are tough, it's the key people of influence that become even more valuable and even more in demand. And if you've been in business for a while, you're probably a lot closer than you think. So every week that this COVID-19 thing continues, I'm going to be hosting a weekly talk to be able to help business leaders like yourself recalibrate their focus so they can make the most of the times that we're in. If you're interested in jumping on a Zoom and saying hi with me, you can find the link to register for my sessions as well as all of the crisis response team sessions at dent.global/reinvent. If you found this useful, let us know. My name's Glenn Carlson, and please be brave, have fun. Let's go make a dent in the universe.